Hello again, witches, seekers, and friends, and welcome to the Fat Feminist Witch podcast, the show where we do a little ranting, raving, and wand waving. I'm your host, Paige Vanderbeck, and together we're going to explore magic and spirituality, social justice, the psychic realm, and truly modern witchcraft. Hello, my witchy, wonderful, proud friends, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Fat Feminist Witch podcast. I'm really excited about today's topic. We're going to step back from the practical witchcraft today and talk about a more maybe esoteric aspect of what it means to be a witch. We are going to talk about gender. Witch is a term that has long been associated primarily with women. Cis women specifically. And in our modern age, even those who do not practice can use the word witch as one of female empowerment. You know, it's a word that's commonly associated with the feminist movement, the movement to make the lives of women better and more equal. Witch is a word that once murdered women. It murdered women. It led to their deaths. But now it's one that can grant us power. But women aren't the only ones who are witches, who can use the word witch, who can be a witch. To be a witch is not to be a woman, but to be a witch is to carry the spirit and sacrifice of all the other witches, and by extension, women who came before. You don't have to be a cis woman to be connected to this line of people or to the power that came through them, or that still comes from women who are alive today. I hope that by now you all know that I am someone who believes gender is fluid. It's tricky, it's beautiful, it's fun, and it's creative. It can also be used as a weapon, like it is against women and witches in the past. But I would never want to weaponize something like that. So in today's episode, when I say women, I mean anyone who is a woman. When I say man, I mean anyone who is a man. And I believe that those two ends of the spectrum really only scratch the surface of the big, wide, magical world of human gender and sexuality. It's a big, big, big thing. And man and woman are very tiny, tiny things in that big, big world. So if you are wondering if you have a place in this conversation, I am here to tell you that you do. You always have a place here with me, no matter where on that gender spectrum you fall in your life, on any given day, in any given minute. Feminism and witchcraft are all about balancing power in the world, about seeing beauty in everyone and everything, and about making a world where everyone has the freedom to understand themselves and to share themselves with others in a safe way. Okay? That is so important to me. So today let's talk about gender, and specifically how embracing the aspects of gender that are typically aligned with femininity can be a source of power and can be very fun, can be entertaining. I am absolutely thrilled to have a guest today who's going to shed some light on this. I think this is probably the first guest I've ever had on the show who is not technically a witch or involved in witchcraft in any way. Pretty excited. So Andy, or Andrew L. Erdman, as he's called on the cover of his new book, Beautiful, the Story of Julian Eltinge, America's Greatest Female Impersonator, is here to talk to me about drag queens, drag performance, female impersonation. Vaudeville is Andy's specialty, and he has other books on the subject that you can check out. Of course, there will be tons of links in the description where you can find him and find his work and find the books. But today, we're talking about Julian Eltinge, and about how drag fit into the world of entertainment during and even before vaudeville. Andy and I also talk about how this art form, this way of playing with gender, has evolved over time and what it means to people today. Before we launch into it, I want to talk about a little something called glamour. If there is one word that I would use to describe drag performance, and those who do it, it is glamour. The lights, the sets, the stage, the glitz, the glitter, the makeup, the falsies, the insane footwear. It is all so glamorous, so outrageous. Interestingly, it simultaneously pokes fun at our ideas of what glamour even is. What makes a person glamorous? A drag queen is there to show you and also to make fun of it. The word glamour is a very old one, and it referred to a magic spell cast, by a witch. One of those nasty evil witches, not good witches like us. We would never do that. A glamour was a spell of illusion that would turn the witch into something or someone enticing, a form that could confuse, bewitch, or ensnare the target of the spell. Eventually, it came to be used to describe things that were just attractive or beautiful or luxurious, things that you couldn't help but reach out and to touch or to covet for yourself. We use the word mainly to describe women's beauty and women's beauty products, women's clothes. And this is certainly a double-edged sword. It's a beautiful word, and we think of lovely, beautiful things, but that original energy given to the word is still present in its usage. Glamour says that women are putting on an act. In some ways, maybe they're trying to trick you into seeing what you want. Maybe they're hiding who they are behind makeup or clothing because this will get them something from you. Using the word glamour or glam can be a reclamation, just as much as using the word witch, though glam is perhaps a little bit sneakier, a little bit more subtle. It doesn't have quite so negative a connotation anymore, right? Modern witches still use glamour magic, though it's not usually for some nefarious purpose, right? Many of us dress in ways that we think convey magic, convey power, or perhaps even do allow us to enchant others. We dress certain ways during ritual. We dress certain ways that connect us to a goddess or to an energy or to a spell or in colors that help us raise a particular energy. We use glamour to enhance our magical practice. I know that sometimes I love to put on all black with my big honkin' pentacle earrings, my little pointy hat, and all of my moon-shaped jewelry when I want everyone around me to see, bad witch walking. This tells people who would view this negatively to back the fuck up. It's a protection spell. But it's also a signal to other witches and to others who are open to this kind of energy that I am someone that they can and maybe even should want to connect with. It's an attraction spell. It also signals something to me. When I look in the mirror, I see that bad witch walking and I feel that I am expressing a part of myself that is so, so important to me. I am also reveling in the great privilege that I have to express to be a witch. I never take this freedom for granted. It's only a few short centuries ago that this would have been a death sentence, that the who I am and how I want to live would literally get me executed. In some parts of the world, it still could. I don't need a costume to be a witch, but to don the glamour of this persona is to honor the long line of witches, women, people who made it safe for me to do so. It's a form of worship. I worship the witch in all of their forms. I throw the hatred and evil and condemnation of the people who perpetuated that in their faces. I remind them of what that kind of bigotry can do to the world. I feel as though my witchy appearance makes those who hate me, who hate witches, who hate women, who hate anyone they consider strange or different. I feel like it makes their black, cold hearts even more apparent. My glamour spell breaks theirs. Their illusion as a righteous person is shattered when they feel and express hate into my obvious outpouring of love. drag has not always been hated, but in this century, it has been persecuted. It is reviled by those who consider it to be, a degenerate act, by those who accuse anyone in drag of being a predator, and even those who think it denigrates women. And many of those critics, particularly, are women, which is, Andy and I actually do talk about that just a little bit, because I think that is one of the more, I think that is one of the criticisms that I understand where it's coming from, but I also completely disagree, right? The term drag seems to have originated in the 1800s, but men dressing as women in entertainment is truly ancient. In ancient Athens, they had drag shows. Aristotle loved himself a drag show. So for most of history, women were not permitted to be on stage. They weren't permitted to be anywhere, so men had to play women's roles. And this did evolve into dressing as a woman being the point of the show, to see a man try to embody the energy of a woman. Some were so convincing, they successfully cast the glamour, and others not so much. But it was fun. That was the point. And you'll hear more about how it evolved in the 20th century in a moment when we launch in with Andy. But in my mind, dressing in drag works just like my witchy little glamour spell. It allows somebody to embody an energy that makes them feel powerful, sure, but also that allows them to express something important that's inside them already. It's a part of themselves. Even if you are someone who is cis or who is of, one distinct gender all the time, there are no doubt parts of you that others may consider to be from another point along that spectrum. And I don't mean your physical parts, I mean inside. In my experience, many of the men I meet who proudly call themselves witches are in tune with parts of themselves that you might call woman-coded. I can't speak for them, but I'd bet my last dollar that is not simply a coincidence. Likewise, the men who transform into the drag queen often have some of that queenly energy outside of their performance. It's them. It's a presence. It's a vibe. It's an air of authority and of beauty. It's the same kind of energy that I associate with a goddess. When I look at the queens that are popular now, all I see are goddesses. I see a larger-than-life woman, and I don't just mean that physically, again, although that too. I see a larger-than-life woman with a voice, a big, powerful voice, with the magic to command a room, to draw people out of their shell and to pull them towards them. I see someone who inspires others to reach down very deep and love some inner part of themselves that the world wants them to hide. I see someone who had something so big and so magical inside them and they just couldn't keep it in. To do that would diminish their own light, and that's just not what we want anybody to do. And in doing this, I see them breaking the illusion, the glamour spell of the good conservative. When someone shows up to a drag queen story hour under the guise of protecting children, but then hurls slurs and hatred or even, projectiles right in the faces of those same children, their spell is broken. There's no hiding it now. That person is filled with hate. They are not protecting any actual people. They are trying to protect an oppressive boundary. Something that forces the world into a box. But we don't belong there. The world isn't square. It's this big, weird, fluid, sparkly mess. And one of the very best ways to splash around in it is with a beautiful woman calling you honey and making you laugh at how outrageous it all can be. Drag is glamour. Drag is magic. And drag, by extension, is witchcraft. So just like we do here on the show with our witchy past, Let's dive into the history of drag with Andy and with Julian Eltinge, America's greatest female impersonator.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about Julian Eltinge and how he became, you know, America's or the world's most popular female impersonator at the time.
Yeah, yeah. So, around Julian Eltinge was actually born just outside of Boston, and when he was a little kid, his mother got him into doing these sort of toddler shows where they would dress up boys as girls. Although boys at the time could often be dressed and styled like what we think of in a feminine way, with like long
Yeah.
curly hair. It's kind of the Little Lord Fauntleroy era,
Yeah.
and that's a whole other fascinating story for and Burnett. But his father drags he hears the call of the West and sort of the frontier and this Teddy Roosevelt, go and extract riches from the land, and he drags the family all over the Americas. He never strikes it rich. He basically becomes
Oh.
more drunk and bitter, and he's kind of a
Mm,
failure as a man. But his son Billy starts to notice, like, I like theater, I like impersonating, I like actors, because you kind of meet
cool.
those kind of people. And so Billy and Mother, I think they've sort of had it with Dad, and they come back to Boston around 1880, 1895, 96, and he's kind of looking around for different things. And he works in some different places, and he starts taking dance lessons because he's a good dancer, he's a good singer. He has that magical something, that like
Yeah.
performers do. And he starts doing something called cakewalking, which was a kind of minstrelized Black American art form that kind of like taken by like white performers, a little like hip hop today. And
Yeah.
he eventually becomes this sort of like darling of Boston high society. He does these incredible impersonations of women. He can dance, he can sing, he's very polite. Plus, he's very like, hey, I just do that because I'm really good at it. But when I'm not in drag, I'm like boxing and smoking cigars and trading stocks and and so they adopt him. And so he gets into these semi-professional musicals that are put on by the Boston Corps of Cadets, which is a military unit. But they
Yeah.
really like
Wow.
their drag musicals. It was all guys. And he's sort of like, and by the way, these are a lot of like famous, Boston families, high society. And he sort of wangles his way in. And he's like, well, I guess if nobody notices, I'll just sing a little. And Robert A. Barnett, who's in charge, is like, that kid's good. So he becomes a big star of these semi-amateur musicals that are very popular in Boston. And then from there, he has a bit of a misstep trying to go into a professional musical that kind of is a flop. But he gets into vaudeville, and he starts impersonating women in this very precise, you can see, kind of illusionistic
Yeah.
way. And it's just at the time page when female impersonation and drag starts to emerge from being really just seen in a either really it's held in low regard, or you can see it in minstrel shows and blackface minstrel shows, to sort of becoming like a national craze, like
Yeah.
men, like businessmen, college dudes, music hall performers, the military. Everyone's doing different kinds of drag. And I say drag, I mean that broadly speaking, from his very illusionistic, impressionistic women to to more campy, sort of cartoonish, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Maybe that was more of an answer than you wanted. That's the kit and caboodle.
No, that was great, and actually, it kind of led into what I was going to ask was, what was the difference between what Julian was doing and drag today? And I think that photo you have on the cover of the book is a very kind of obvious difference where he looks like a woman, yet you would
Totally.
see, walking down the street. He's not RuPaul where everything's very big and
Exactly.
exaggerated. Um,
Yeah.
I saw online that he even crossed into Hollywood. He was in a few movies.
Absolutely, yeah. So first of all, he then, by the way, his long aspiration, this is a great through line for him, is to sort of get out of the drag and just be taken seriously as an actor, which he never really succeeds at.
Oh,
But he does. I guess I shouldn't spoiler alert for the readers, but he does eventually get musicals written for him where he
wow.
plays a guy, a normal guy, who has to drag up. And when he drags up, he looks exactly like a woman. So he's 1 degree away from drag. And I will get back to your question. And then he makes movies, silent movies, that are also successful for a while
Yeah.
until they're not. But I think it's what's important to understand at the time is that there was a whole range of drag artistry from people who really were these very, for lack of a better word, feminine, sensual, really meant to fool people in almost like a P.T. Barnum kind of way or a Houdini kind of way, to the more campy. And I think the more so like Bert Savoy was probably the best known, more camp, somebody we would think of today as being more cartoonish and subverting gender and playing on gender, and maybe a bit more what might have been called in the time inverted, which is to say gay, or sort of like, I don't, I'm not really trying to be a man, honey, you know,
Yeah.
this more precise gender artistry, which, by the way, these days, I think you can see, I'm not an expert on this, but you can see there are real gender illusionists who do online, who have online personas, whether it's
Absolutely.
Instagram or Pinterest, who are really like fascinating. So
Absolutely. And I think that was I looked up photos and that was instantly what I noticed. I'm like, this is not the same as what we consider drag today.
totally.
This is not quite as exaggerated as it was. So during his time, was it as associated with the gay community, with men who really wanted to live as women, or was it totally separate?
Yeah, again, a good question. A lot of things are changing, and even our notions of what is gay as an identity. There certainly were men. There's a great book called Gay New York, which I recommend to people. George Chauncey's book. It's kind of the pioneering history of, and it shows like in the earlier part of the century, before a kind of reactionary backlash, there were men who were fairly open about either sometimes liking to wear women's clothing or having sex with other men who weren't necessarily pathologized or demonized. There was sort of more room for it, particularly in the 20s when things are kind of roaring. Um, and um, and also like a gay identity formed politically that would start to happen, particularly, when gay men had to really live underground in the 40s and 50s, and then
Hmm.
sort of with Stonewall, with the AIDS era. So he was very, very quiet and tight-lipped about his sexual life. It's on. He probably had sexual relations with other men, but he never wanted that to be known. And he tried to come across as a man who didn't. I think maybe
Yeah.
to a few friends and intimates, he was known to you could sort of like relax a little bit. So it was the beginning of the intertwining of drag, gay subculture. You really see this in Mae West's plays of the late 20s, for which she gets a lot of heat. But it's all kind of coming together. By the way, also bear in mind that like this is a time when sexuality starts to transfer from who's the authority on it has been the church,
Yeah.
and in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, now it's medicine and science. Like, what do we? This is strange. It's like, is there a sickness here? So
Yeah.
all the balls are in the air, as it were.
That's really cool. That's really interesting. I
Yeah.
It's so neat to think of, the military going to drag shows. Like that
Hmm.
is that is so different than what would happen today. How do we go from men loving drag shows to them being such a controversial topic? Like how did we get here? What
Well,
happened in between?
yeah, yeah, and in a way, it's comforting because you can kind of see it happening again. There obviously are some differences. Um,
Mhm.
Masha Gessen, who's written a lot about authoritarianism, and who's uh, they're a trans or gender. I don't know exactly what Masha's definition is, but they would say that like um, the reaction is about, it very often takes the form of like trying to conform or delineate gender dualities and binarities to go back to a past that never really existed. So
Mhm.
it's one of the front lines of like, plus there's all this fear of communism at the time. Uh, Surprise, surprise. And it's like drag, homosexuality, are associated with sort of this great red menace that's out there, and then it's 19, anyway, it gets into the 20s and 30s when the world economy is falling apart. So much going on, so much anxiety. But
I
yeah,
think that's I think that's actually kind of funny because I feel like Russia would probably flip that nowadays. They probably see homosexuality and by extension drag as certainly like a Western problem, you know?
Oh, very much, very much. By the way, Julian Elting was offered a very lucrative contract to tour in Russia, because he was very popular in Europe, but
Cool.
under the condition that he never be just Julian Elting. He always had to be in drag, and he was like, I don't know if I quite want to go that far. So you have to give the Russians credit for committing, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, they really wanted 100% from him.
not a people of moderation. And by the way, during World War One, there were some very popular drag musicals that were created and produced in the military, the Canadian military, the US military. They performed in like war-torn France. They were hugely popular. The men were, this is also at the same time that a lot of colleges are putting on these original musicals. And there are different kinds of male performers, and the sort of young, pretty ones are called broilers because
Mhm.
they're like tender young chickens, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's totally like, you know, totally
Wow.
normalized. Yeah.
That is so cool. I
Yeah.
love, especially I mean, drag in general is incredibly old. Like, it's very, very
Yes.
old. It
Yes.
definitely predates Julian, right?
Sure.
In ancient Greece, they
Hmm.
women weren't allowed to be on stage, so men had to
Hmm.
play the women's parts, and then that in itself took off. So drag is very, very old, and it's still going. How did we get from, what's the difference between female impersonation and drag? How did we go away from female impersonation just to the campy drag? How did we kind of solidify the definition?
Yeah, yeah. So, and it's good that you referred to history. So, yeah, women generally don't appear on the Western stage,
Mhm.
other than in like commedia dell'arte troupes, these kind of mime troupes. And there are some women in France, but let's just talk about England and the U.S. And North America. Um, During Shakespeare's day, men played all the parts,
Yeah.
and they very famously played women parts illusionistically, like Lady Macbeth, Juliet. Those were written for men,
Yeah.
boy players. Then the theater is banned altogether because, blah, blah, religious people are anxious, got to get rid of the theater. It comes back in 1660 after being banned for 18 years. There's some private theater, but what's really interesting is that actresses are now allowed to perform. And instead of being like, a little dribble of like they're kind of getting their footing, there are superstars like all of a sudden. They're like amazing. It's like they've been waiting, and they're
Yeah.
fantastic. So women like Anne Bracegirdle, and there's some other famous Mrs. Colley Cibber. There are some famous actresses who are hugely popular, but there's still a lineage of some impersonation. So you have Edward Kinniston playing Lady Macbeth, and then you have Anne Bracegirdle playing Lady Macbeth. I don't know if that's but something like that. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of debate amongst Londoners, like who's better, who's got the better set of legs. You know,
I love that.
eventually, yeah, exactly. Like eventually, so it's very illusionistic, right? And
Mhm.
written these very, I don't always know about serious, but poetic dramas.
Yeah.
Eventually, the women win out because they become so popular. Like women become superstars. They start to have some actually autonomy. So the men start to become campier and campier. They become dame characters, and they sort of eventually end up after a while, they end up really in the music hall, which is kind of like vaudeville comedy, kind of dragging it up. And that's where it kind of goes. It sort of ends up being this kind of ghettoized subculture. Um, and then it starts to reemerge. Real female impressionism starts to reemerge right around Julian's time and with his help. And so he's like atop the wave. And then it kind of explodes again for the next 30, 40 years. And then it starts to shut down again.
Wow. So
Yeah.
so what happened to Julian? You said he didn't he never broke free of his drag acting, and what happened to him?
Yeah, yeah. So like I said, he hooks up with a producer around 1910, 1908, 1909. This producer in New York named A.H. Woods, who's a real kind of old school cigar chomping impresario who really is like a father figure and really takes him in and says like, kid, I'm going to build a theater and name it after you. And but he's also like, and there was a Julian Elting Theater on 42nd Street. It literally, I don't know if a lot of people know this. It was literally it fell into disrepair, and then it was um, picked up and moved like 800 feet down West 42nd Street in New York. And now it's
Wow.
the AMC movie complex. It's the same theater. And you can see what are
That's wild.
Julian Elting's impersonations in fresco on the ceiling. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. There's a New York Times article. I talk about it in the book, but
That's
it's
so wild. Like I've been to that theater. That's so
Mhm.
cool.
Me too. Before I even know exactly, exactly. They
Wow,
discovered
that is so cool.
anyway. So A.H. Woods is like, we're gonna write these special musicals for you. You're just gonna be like an ordinary guy, but like what? Now I have to dress up like a woman. They're very successful. He does three of them. They're very exhausting. They're touring.
Mhm.
He never really hits it big in Broadway, but he's very popular in the provinces, as it were. Right?
Yeah.
At a certain point, it's like 1917. He's like, I have to oops, get rid of that. At a certain point, he's like, I want to make the leap to film. So he goes and he goes to Paramount, um, and he makes the same kind of movies. They're very popular, they're very funny. And he um, after three movies, he then makes a World War One themed movie,
Mm.
and this is like 1918, end of 1918. It's you have to remember how quickly movies could be made and how quickly tastes could change at the time.
Absolutely.
So when World War One was still going on, it was like rah rah rah, beat the Kaiser. He was all like, you know. Then the war ended and people wanted nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So his movie is shelved. It's recut. Now it's not a war movie. Now it's an adventure movie. Then it turns out that Rudolph Valentino, who had a small part in it, is all of a sudden a huge, sex symbol
Wow.
and
Yeah,
star.
he's
So
huge.
they recut the movie to make it a Rudolph Valentino movie. It's like crazy. But his film career kind of like peters out very quickly, as can happen in our day.
Yeah. I was
Um,
just gonna say movies these days also, they move so, so fast.
so, yeah, exactly, exactly. And so he's kind of so it's the early 20s. He's getting a little older now, right? He can't quite play the young beauty. His movie career is kind of, no one necessarily wants to take a chance on him. So he starts going back to vaudeville. Vaudeville's kind of in decline now.
Yeah.
Couple things to remember too. You have the rise of speakeasies and cabarets, and so he starts doing this kind of cabaret culture that starts to be associated with gay and drag life in particularly in the 30s. And he launches this artists colony slash spa retreat center in way Southern California near San
Cool.
Diego, and he's a very brilliant designer. Kind of, he loves architecture. He really he built. So I live in an area called Los Feliz. Right near here is Silver Lake. He built one of the first great movie star mansions on top of a hill in
Wow.
Silver Lake. That's this Moorish palazzo. It's actually very tasteful. I've been inside. Surprisingly tasteful. So he loves design. So he's going to build. This is his grand plan. Unfortunately, this spa retreat, which is called like El Rancho Sierra Vista,
Wow. That's
Sierra Vista
beautiful.
Rancho. What's that?
That's beautiful. It sounds relaxing. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. There's an episode of The Simpsons where Marge goes to Rancho Relaxo. So when I always
Yeah.
want he launched Rancho Relaxo, but he launches it in like 1928. Uh,
Oh,
so
uh-oh.
turns out a hard business to make money in it at any time. So
Mhm.
he kind of ends up going back on tour to make more money, but then he puts it into the rancho. He has to sell his palace, and he kind of peters out. And then in the 30s, there's this real reaction against drag, against, anything perceived to be inversive or homosexual. And he's having health problems. He was never the most, vaudevillians are not known for being the most like balanced humans. And
No.
so he goes back, and then eventually, so he's doing then in LA where he's living, they pass ordinances against drag, and he has to
Mm,
appear and before a judge and argue his case. He gets like a
wow.
special dispensation because he's so famous. Like he's allowed to sort of, basically go back to what he was doing, but everybody else is really shut down. And by the way, interestingly, he also is somewhat, for lack of a better term, conservative or libertarian. Like he doesn't lean into the fight. He's like, taxes are too high, and I'm just a normal guy, and
Yeah.
I don't want to, he really doesn't want to be associated with any kind of out groups, literally or figuratively. And then at the end in 1941, he goes back to New York to do a gig at the Billy Rose's Diamond Horseshoe, and he does a set of shows for a few months. He's living in a place on West 57th Street, incidentally, in a building where I used to have an office a long time ago.
That's
Um,
wild.
Pure coincidence, yeah.
What a
And
wild coincidence. Wow.
totally wild, totally wild. Yeah, yeah. He also happens to. There are other coincidences between me and him. Like he's interred. Well, he was cremated at a crematorium right near where I grew up in Westchester County, and now he's buried in Glendale, which is a couple of miles from me now. So anyway, he's around, guy's around. But he succumbs. He succumbs in 1941, I think, to a combination of long running health things. I think he was probably pretty depressed. Maybe, maybe he sort of wanted to go. I don't really know, but he sort of
Yeah,
ends. He ends, and it's very emblematic of like the end of that era because now we begin the much more conservative, at least in a broader sense, 40s and 50s, where like
absolutely.
homosexuals and the drag artists are other.
Yeah. Yeah, they're really they're grouped together, and then they're really driven into hiding places. They really
Totally,
have to
totally
hide from it.
underground. Yeah. And
Wow.
persecuted. Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
absolutely. So, how come more people don't know his name? Like, how come he's not more popular? How did he become so obscure?
It's interesting. That's always a good question. My last book was about Eva Tangway, who was a huge star. She was as They were both about both famous and successful. They even had this like sham engagement for a while, where like because she hated marriage. He wasn't going to get married, but the idea was like she was going to wear the tuxedo and he was going to wear the dress, and it was really this
I
great
love it.
stunt. It was great, yeah. Eva Tangway was somebody who was really forgotten until I started doing a long time ago my dissertation research on vaudeville. And what I came to really appreciate is so many people are forgotten. It's actually rare that people are remembered. Like
Yeah,
even Mae West, who was arguably not more famous than either of these two, kind of got revitalized. She also, listen, if you make movies and the movies become classics, or you make recordings, or you write a book, that can live on. But even a lot of those people get forgotten. I think Julian, there are people in the sort of LGBTQ world and culture community over the years that have tried to resuscitate him as like this great forgotten drag artist. But then also like, huh, he seemed a little ambivalent about identity, you
yeah,
know, and then so he's been kind of, I don't think that there's one answer. There are people who've always been interested in Julian Elting. And then there are many, many people who don't know who he is. And I think it's something of the vagaries of fate and history. And, um, there are people we discover now who are like lost artists. And it's like, this is amazing. Look at the work this person was doing.
yeah.
And maybe people will read the book and at least appreciate his place in history. So
That would be wonderful. I would love that. Yeah, I was so shocked when I was reading it. I was like, this is a really interesting story. This is a really, really cool story. And it's I think how different it is from what we think of as drag now, is what makes it so interesting. It really shows you how far we've come. Like you said, he wasn't really involved in the political side, the advocacy side, and now that is a huge part of the drag identity.
exactly, and to even complicate matters further, I ask myself, which is more subversive? Somebody who unconsciously completely kind of fits into the accepted identity of a woman, which makes a kind of deal with central culture, with conventional culture that loves him, and is like, yeah, it's fine. This is fine. You enjoy this.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is the deal we're going to make because we really like drag. This,
Yeah.
it doesn't, it raises a certain kind of excitement that doesn't cross over into anxiety. And we're cool with this, right? You're cool. I'm cool with this. You're cool with this. And so in a way, he's very subversive. And there's also a message that comes out more overtly because he marketed like beauty products for women, and he endorsed
Wow.
corsets, and he endorsed shoes, and he had like a beauty counter in one of his theaters.
Wow.
Um, that basically was saying, and he unfortunately becomes a little bit more misogynistic over time, but basically is
Mm.
like, hey, ladies, if I can do it, you
Yeah.
know, you can do it. You should do it. In
Yeah.
fact, there's a whole science to it. I'm
Wow.
just a scientist. There's a science to being a woman. Being a man is natural.
Yeah,
Okay,
of course.
once in a while you have to smoke a cigar or put on an evening coat, but women, you got to work at it, and you really got to work hard at it. Look how hard I work at it. So it's
Yeah.
like, which is more subversive? I don't know. You know, Ask Judith
You got a
Butler.
good point. Yeah. You've got a good point. So, I mean, how well did he pass? Did everyone know that he was a man dressed as a woman when they went to see his shows, or,
Well,
were there people that were fooled?
both, it seems. Some
Cool.
people clearly, he was so famous that some people clearly knew.
Yeah.
But kind of going in, it's like going to a magic show. You suspend your disbelief. Or going to a movie, you're like, if you stop and think like this is made by a bunch of people on a film set, but you go into suspension of disbelief. There were other people who clearly, I think, and maybe they were quieter about it, really liked the fact that they were having this double experience. And
Yeah.
that maybe the fantasy at some level is like there's a male anatomy underneath all that, like silk. Other people were surprised or claimed to be surprised. Other people were like, it was like going to see Houdini. They
Yeah.
knew Houdini, Houdini's going to get out of it. Well, I guess the one time he didn't, but Houdini going to get out of it. But you go to see it anyway.
Yeah.
And then I do think that as popular and great as he was in vaudeville, it is a little unsustainable. So then he gets into these narrative forms. How's this young guy gonna, win over the girl and get back the stolen diamonds and fool the father and da, 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 So
That's funny. That's a
yeah,
real funny that's actually a pretty funny storyline. I would
yeah,
watch that. I would totally
totally,
watch that.
totally. Yeah, it's unfortunate a lot of his movies have been lost, but
Hmm. It
um,
happens with some of these older ones. The film doesn't quite make it to the present.
he made a movie, by the way, in 1925 called Madam Behave. That is on YouTube. You can watch. I talk
Oh,
about it in the
cool.
book. It's not his like
Write that
best work, but you can get a sense. He's getting a little frowsy by that point. Uh,
down.
you get a sense of like it's kind of funny in a way. It has a lot of, and then also, by the way, one more thing is when talkies come, everybody rushes to make a talkie. It's almost like you can imagine when like virtual reality movies are the thing. Everyone's going to make them, and a lot are going to suck.
Oh, yeah.
He makes a talkie called Made, MAID, to order, and it is not very good. And he just
Mm.
kind of can't. And he tries radio. Like this guy doesn't go on the radio. I mean, look at how he looked.
Doesn't really work. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So technology doesn't serve him particularly well. Same was true of like Eva Tangway because she was such a great live star. She couldn't
Yeah.
quite translate, but other people can. I don't know. Sophie Tucker made recordings, and Al Jolson made movies. So anyway.
That's neat. I tried to imagine what it would be like what it would take for me to, just be able to believably act as a man, not even the clothing and stuff, but to,
Yeah.
get down the mannerisms and the movement and the everything of a man. And like, I don't think that I could actually do that. That's an amazing, like, that's a talent. That's a real talent.
I think it
He-
was one of his superpowers
Yeah,
that
because that's nuts. Even online, if someone's talking to me and they say they're a woman and they're kind of shady, sometimes I can tell, like, the way you talk, the way you use certain
yep.
words. I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure that that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, no. I think he had a real sixth sense about it. And it was
Yeah.
part of what people really picked up about him so in a way, like he proves this kind of gender fluidity in a way that
Yeah.
he would have been horrified by. But people used to talk about how he stood
Yeah.
and that he moved with the very essence of a woman. Like those are the kind of words they used. Like, look at how he rises. Look at how he puts his hands on his hips. This is also in an age when um, posturing and posing is meant to convey a lot of information about someone.
Yeah.
I guess it's still true, but in a different way. So yeah, no, you're
Definitely true.
totally. He passes.
Yeah, that's a real skill. That's a real skill. I can't imagine I can't imagine how interesting it would be to see him, switch from one identity to the other. You watch the show, you see him backstage and he's a completely different person who moves and acts differently.
Well, I think that was both part of his brand and part of, yeah, he would often at the end of his shows take off the wig and there'd be like,
Wow.
that moment like total cognitive dissonance. And then for a while, when he was doing live shows, his backstage transformation was kind of part of his act. It was all over the newspapers. Like he shows up in like a business suit with a hat, and then he spends 4 hours putting on different kinds of makeups, and he has a valet. And then, by the way, also of a part with this is he put a lot of publicity into what might be called his offstage masculine drag,
Yeah.
which is look, like I said, I'm friends with all these boxers and I like to smoke cigars and go fishing and hunting. And I think he did like all those things. I think there were other things that he kept quiet about. And also, who knows how he thought of himself, what he let
Absolutely.
himself be. Like that for me is a really interesting question. So dependent on environment and personality.
Absolutely. Which identity was the drag really, you know,
Exactly.
and I think,
Exactly.
I actually think so much of gender in general for a lot of us is kind of a little bit of drag, you know. There's definitely some things that we exaggerate or that we do on purpose to, you know, to present the gender that, you know, we think we should be or that we are. And
Absolutely.
I think that's what's so neat about the idea of drag in general.
Yeah, consciously or unconsciously, and it even extends, of course, to like cultural groups we belong to,
Yeah.
like why do I used to think like why do architects, not that I know that many, but like why do they all have the same glasses, or psychiatrists of a certain age, they all look like Freud, they all had the same. There's even like mannerisms and ways of speaking, and they become very pronounced, to say, I'm a blue collar worker. I live here. I'm from the South. I'm from the North. Like we're always dragging in different ways. You know?
Absolutely. That's
So
so true.
yeah.
Um, so you said you were working, you were studying vaudeville for your dissertation. Is that how you learned about Julian, and is that why you got interested enough to write the book?
Yeah. Initially, a long time ago, I was in a PhD program. I thought I was going to be a college professor, and it came time to write a dissertation. And I was like, I don't know. And I've grown up on like sketch comedy. Like my brother and I used to write sketch comedy, and I grew up watching Carol Burnett. And so I loved like comedy, and vaudeville seemed really interesting to me. I went through some different discussions with my academic advisors and blah, blah, but I ended up writing about vaudeville. From there, I discovered Eva Tangway. Then I discovered, this is after I graduated, like nobody had like actually written a biography of her. So I foolishly went about writing a biography of her. And through that, I became introduced to Julian. And then when I started researching this book, I was like, I love that time period. I love pulling together archival materials and newspaper sources and trying to tell a story and looking at the culture. And I was like, Julian Elting. So I did a little poking around, and nothing had been written about him. And also, as you can appreciate by this time, this is like, 2020, 2021, so much, you can do so much online
Yeah.
research. It's almost embarrassing. Like for my last book, I did a lot more traveling. For this
Yeah.
book, I did a lot more of sitting in front of my computer, and which was good because it was COVID, but
Yeah.
so, oh, by the way, I also do love going into archives, and there were some that went into, and they were wonderful. And they're like, here, they put a box down, and there's like, the Dead Sea Scrolls are in there,
I
so
love that. I love
yeah,
that. When I was in college, I had to
yeah,
do a project. I was a little bit older than everybody else. I was
uh-huh,
25, so I wasn't, you know, geriatric, but I was 25 and I actually went to, you know, one of the little local museums and I was like,
sure.
I'm doing some research. Do you happen to have, you know, records about this or this? And you could see them just light up. They're like, oh, you want to do
Oh,
some research here? And they took me upstairs and they made me a cup of tea and they brought out all these big, huge, like city records. They were so
oh,
excited to have someone come in.
course. When I was writing the book about Eva, so one of the major repositories of vaudeville documentation is at the University of Iowa. And it's all these
Interesting.
managers' report books. And they were managers of it. Vaudeville was organized in big chains, big corporate chains. So the managers would watch every single act, write a report like, this guy was great, but his jokes weren't that funny because he kept talking about Philadelphia and everyone here doesn't, or whatever, or the guy's dogs weren't obeying him. It's pretty funny to watch. Um, so those report books. So when I wrote my last book, I went out to Iowa City, and they would like wheel over, like this would never happen in New York, but in Iowa City, they just wheel over these 100-year-old like books and like open them up for me. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Well, now they put them all online, which is fantastic. I didn't
Yeah.
have to go to Iowa City, but it also makes it a little takes away some of the magic somehow.
Yeah, a
But
little bit.
mm,
A little bit. They were like, "We haven't had anyone come in here in years to, like, do research." I'm like,
yeah.
"Damn, kids, like, you're
Did, did
breaking
you
these librarians' hearts."
did you grow up in Toronto and go to school in Toronto, or
No, I live in Windsor, Ontario, so I'm a few hours,
you live
south.
in Ontario?
I'm
Okay,
right near Detroit, Michigan, like, I can see it
got
out my
it.
window, right? It's right
Right
across
across
the
the way.
river.
Sure, sure, sure. Okay, yeah.
There's actually quite a bit of drag here, quite a bit of drag out of
Really?
Detroit. Um,
Well,
most of the drag that comes out of Detroit is definitely they're like impersonating like Motown singers,
oh, of
which
course.
is oh, just combining like the best of both worlds, you know. So
Exactly.
you have these incredible, you know, Martha Reeves or Diana Ross style drag performers, which are just always so good.
Hey, let me ask you, What do you think people, and I realize there's different consumers want different
Mm.
things, but what do you think people get out of drag? Why do we like it? What comes to your mind?
I think it's a lot of different things. I know that when I first started seeing drag performers, especially I would go to burlesque shows and there would be,
Hmm.
a drag performer kind of in the middle, or a drag performer would be the MC or something like
Yeah,
that. What I liked is you would see these women doing this act, and they're taking off their clothes and they're doing the whole thing. Um the real feminine mystique whole vibe. And then you
yes,
have this drag performer come out, and it's very exaggerated, it's very funny, they have a really good sense of humor about it. And just seeing the difference, I know that's not how that performer actually sees women. I know we don't all
yeah,
see women that way, but it definitely has this particular vibe. You have to cake on the makeup, you have to put on all of these lashes, this crazy wig, the big high heels. Like, that guy is killing himself for
yeah,
this for this female impersonation. And I'm like, that is definitely what it feels like sometimes to just be, a regular level of woman. Like, it's validating to see like
absolutely.
how much work that is. I know a lot of people, one of the problems some people have with drag is it's like, "Oh, it's making fun of women." I'm like, "Sure it is." I mean, if you wanna be, like, really technical about it, sure it is, but they're not really making fun of women specifically, like, as people. They're making fun of all of the stuff we have to do to be women,
Yes,
to be beautiful or sexy or funny or entertaining, and that stuff's funny. That
yeah.
stuff really is, like, it's like clown makeup sometimes, really.
Oh, it's like, and people who read the book will see like that was very much Julian Elting's experience of like one of the quotes I have at the front of the book is, "It cost me all but the breath of life to become a woman," because here
Absolutely.
he's getting shoehorned into his corset. He goes down to a size 23 corset, which I
Jesus.
I think I had a 23-inch waist when I was like 7. I don't know
Yeah.
exactly what, but
That's wild.
he's and it is a and I think that is what's funny about, just as you said, it shows the extent to which we're all kind of dragging.
Yeah,
And that's why comedy, like I heard it said that like comedy to be truly effective has to be a little bit subversive because it kind of shows
yeah,
this ridiculous act. We're always in the hope nobody notices that I don't
yeah.
burst out of my corset. Like, could we just relax already? So, yeah, yeah. God bless
Yeah,
them.
that's what I always liked about drag, and I think even now with something like RuPaul's Drag Race,
Yeah,
I think the level of, like, work that they have to put in to put on the makeup and come up with a routine and put on those costumes and, have the curves that are not natural to their body, and the voices even, and the expressions. I mean, they've created an entire culture. And again, you could say it's making fun of women, but I don't really think it is. I think it's more making fun of everyone else.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think it comes down to some of the individual artists. I
Yeah.
can detect if somebody has a more hostile vibe, or if someone just has a like, could we just laugh at this? It's interesting too, looking at more quote unquote mainstream culture, because I'm 58, so I came up through the 70s, and in the 70s, the masculine ideal was so we would call androgynous. Uh,
Mhm.
Mick Jagger, David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, like there were men who were even leading men Elliot, what's his name? Oh gosh, he played Monica's father on Friends. Elliot Gould.
Elliot Gold, yeah.
Yeah. These men who are they're not Clint Eastwood. And then sort of in the 80s, the Reagan era, all of a sudden, like Bruce Springsteen, and much as I love Springsteen, I do blame it entirely on him. He shows up as this like buff dude, and now all of a sudden, like, you can't do that.
Yeah,
No, no, no. You got to be working out and stuff, which is funny because also that's such a huge part of gay male culture is this certain kind
absolutely.
of body. Like it's like who, what, when did we decide which kind of muscles? And anyway, my muscles simply will never look that way, so I don't care. No
Actually, I
matter
think
what I
so
do, they're
much.
not going to do that.
Yeah, I think so much of popular male culture this day really feels like gay man drag. Like, they're pretending to be gay. Like, the working
Exactly.
out is really funny, and I don't know, some of the clothes that they're wearing is like, in the '90s, you would have been a gay icon for this
Totally.
outfit, sir, and, like, you're a
That's
super misogynist. Like,
that's always how it starts. This sort of like Van Dyke beards that like the hipsters were wearing in like the
yeah,
80s. like that was, I think, a callback to like Trotsky. Then eventually
Hmm.
you have like sort of like NASCAR drivers, like, wow, you look like Trotsky. Like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
I look like Dale Earnhardt. Whatever. Anyway, not make any more enemies than I may already have. But
It's okay. That's so funny. It's so real though. I think that's what people like about drag is it just makes them it entertains them, but they also even if they don't realize they're doing it, they really are thinking about this stuff just a little bit more. And I know tons of you know, straight guys who watch drag race with their girlfriends and they love it. They think it's really funny. They think it's so over the top and it's entertaining and it takes a lot of work and skill and talent, so it's just performance. I think, it really mirrors the idea of, the military having drag shows.
and speaking of that too, one thing that really came up to me, and I heard Sarah Marshall talk about this on her podcast, You're Wrong About, like, it's so hard for men to just spend time with other men,
Yeah.
not feel freaked out about it. And to
Yeah.
get together, it's so clear that like the first corps of cadets that Julian Elting starts doing these drag musicals with, like they really want to get together. No girls allowed. They
Yep.
want to feel pretty. They want to feel special. They want to put on a show. And I remember, it's funny. I'm like, well, I never, I thought I had no connection to it. Then I realized I went to an all boys, very sports oriented, competitive summer camp.
Yeah.
Um, and there were a few of us who were into music and drama, and they had a little music and drama program, and we would do musicals, and the it was like not even questioned. It was accepted. Yeah, boys are going to play the women's parts, sometimes campier,
Yep.
sometimes very like beautifully and almost erotically. And it was like, of course, like that works.
Yeah.
So our signals and our what we respond to can be very fluid, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's a healthy thing. I think it's a good, healthy, creative thing to just be able to slip into someone else's shoes in general, and I
Totally.
think gender and drag is just one way that we can do that. It's
Yeah.
just a way of wondering what it's like to be somebody else.
I mean, isn't it fun to put on a costume? Like I used to do lots of
Absolutely.
plays and stuff, and like that day you get your costume, you put it on, like it's special.
Yeah,
Like I don't know, it's like it just goes like you're not really who you think you are. Don't take it so seriously,
absolutely.
you know. So
Absolutely. All right, well, that was all the questions that I had for you today. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we, say goodbye here?
not really. I mean, I feel like a lot came out. I think the story is hopefully one that'll keep people's attention and kind of give a little reflection, but also tell this story of an interesting guy's life. Thanks for your interest in my work, and thanks for your
Yeah.
podcast.
I am so grateful that Andy could join me and could talk to us about Julian and about drag. When I first got his email, I wasn't totally sure if this show was the place for it. I talk about witchcraft. But the more I thought about it, the more excited I became. Not only does it fill in yet another piece of the story of, women and feminism and toxic masculinity and just the world in general. But it's important to look outside of just the established boundaries of where we think magic and witchcraft came from and see how this energy has stretched out into the world beyond. And truly, he was such a wonderful person to talk to. He's a great conversationalist. He's so kind. And I like talking to people like that no matter what the topic is. So tons of thanks to Andy. It was such a pleasure. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, and that you leave here today thinking a little bit more about glamour, about gender and how it can be played with and used to express different parts of yourself, and to bring more magic into the world. And of course, about the interesting person that Julian Eltinge was in an already very cool time in our history. You can get your copy of Beautiful, The Story of Julian Eltinge, America's Greatest Female Impersonator, such a good title, by Andrew L. Erdman now, and you should also request that at your local libraries. You can request that they, buy themselves a copy of the book and carry it for everyone, so definitely do that. You can also find out more about Andy and his work at andrewerdman.com. And there are some cool freebies that you can get through the website if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into the delightful world of vaudeville. I hope you all have a wonderful week and a weird, big, sparkly, fluid Pride Month filled with love that encourages you to let your light shine as bright as it possibly can. If you want to learn more about the Fat Feminist Witch podcast or about me, Paige Vanderbeck, you can do so at thefatfeministwitch.ca, not .com.ca. I am Canadian. There you can also find a blog full of recommendations for new books and tarot decks and oracle cards. I talk about tons of different practical magic stuff, which we didn't get to today, but it's all there on the website, and you can also buy a copy of any of my books. I could not do this show at all without the generous support of my friends and followers on Patreon. Just absolutely fabulous, wonderful people. If you want to pitch in and maybe get some extra content, like monthly magical updates and posts and spells and things, you can find all of that at patreon.com/thefatfeministwitch. I also have merchandise, tote bags, stickers, coffee cups, and of course t-shirts, which go up to size 5X on my TeePublic shop at teepublic.com/stores/thefatfeministwitch. Finally, you can track me down on Facebook, Instagram, or Threads, where I can get a little bit more personal and I can interact with you guys a little bit more and answer some questions. I like that. The links to all of these avenues of connection can be found down in the description box below, including any that I think are relevant to help you find out more about today's show. I hope that you'll join me online and that you will tune in again for the next episode of the Fat Feminist Witch podcast.